This is the DRF Players Podcast. Here are your hosts, Peter Thomas Fornatel and Jonathan Kinchin.
Hello and welcome to the DRF Players Podcast. This is show 394, the December 18th, 2018 edition. Happy birthday, Perrin. I'm your host, Peter Thomas Fornatel, back with you in the Brooklyn bunker. JK will be back after his little vacation. He'll be back just a little bit later in the show. You'll hear his voice before the end of the hour, I promise. I know the JK fans out there have been annoyed with me for keeping him on the bench, but we've had such good guests, and that trend is going to continue right now as I bring in. I wish he weren't listening, and I'd tell you how much of an influence he's been to me in my own podcasting. Really terrific show over at The Gist from Slate, which you should all be listening to. Sort of a news pop culture podcast, as if rendered through the lens of Howard Stern. That's what I'm going to call it. I think you'll find that complimentary. He's also an author. I'll leave the specifics aside because we'll be talking about that shortly. He is Mike Pesca. Mike, how are you today?
I'm good. I always said my two greatest sports broadcasting influences were Howard Stern and Mike Francesa.
Mike, who I don't know if I've ever told you my family history with Mike. My dad was his teacher in high school.
Oh,
you know.
He'd have your dad on often.
Exactly. They were buddies. Exactly. And did a lot of great work together, actually, as part of Hungerthon for Why Hunger with my father's friend Bill Ayers and all them. I see the snarky but smart Stern influence I see in your work. Mike, I'm not quite sure I'm seeing the direct link between you and Francesa, but is it just by osmosis all those years of listening to the Pope of New York sports has gotten into yourself?
For the first 25 years of my life, I was pretty addicted to Diet Coke. That was one of them. I remember Francesa. So your dad was his teacher, and they got into a conversation about the Vietnam War, right? And was it that your dad had partly gone into teaching because he had a high draft number? Am I getting that right?
That's entirely possible.
So I know things about your dad from listening to the Mike Francesa interview that you don't know.
That's pretty cool. That's very cool. And Francesa, of course, a horse guy. We got to get him on the show at some point. I mean, he's really consider him a family friend. Met him a bunch of times, and he was kind enough to attend my father's wake a few years ago. Haven't kept up with him as well, but some morning in Saratoga, I'll stick a microphone in his face and we'll get him yapping. Speaking of sticking microphones in people's faces, if I recall correctly, Mike, that's how we initially met at Belmont Park several years ago. I got to be the man on the street in a man on the street interview. Do you remember what that piece was that you were working on?
Yeah, so when I was a reporter for NPR, this was around the time where the Triple Crown hadn't been won. American Pharaoh. This was years before American Pharaoh, and I forgot if it was Silver Charm or one of those guys. I mean, I went 3 or 4 years in a row to the Belmont in case there was a Triple Crown winner, and I was interviewing people, and maybe I was drawn to your hat. I said, "Oh, there's a smart-looking guy," and indeed you were.
I got you fooled. That's for sure. Very cool. Well, listen, I'm having you on. I need some help. I need a holiday gift for my podcast co-host, Jonathan Kinchin. He's a really big sports fan. He was interested in getting a cool new sports book. Do you have any ideas of what I might get him?
Well, assuming he's read the Keith Hernandez autobiography part 2, how about the book that you and I are in upon further review, The Greatest What Ifs in Sports History by Mike Pesca, with contributions from 30 authors, an introduction from Malcolm Gladwell, and a key chapter in there from Peter Thomas Fornatel.
Excellent. Well executed plug right there. Can easily still get it before the holidays, ordering online or supporting your local independent bookseller. Let's talk about the book for a minute. Actually, you mentioned Mr. Gladwell. I wanted to pay tribute, not to your podcasting ability, but your acting ability. I was recently listening to the latest series of Gladwell podcast, and there was I believe it was a congressman from Long Island portrayed by none other than you, Mike. How did you get that gig?
Well, they needed someone to play Norman Lent, and they approached me, and I said, whoa, for the first, 28 years of my life or something, he was my congressman, and I had studied the Norman Lent tapes. And I don't really sound like Norman Lent, but I think I could sound a little like Norman Lent. Not really exactly like him. It wasn't an impression. It was a tribute to Norman Lent. I also benefited from the fact that no one really remembers what Norman Lent sounded like. Although if you can imagine a guy from Long Island whose name is Norman Lent, that's exactly what he sounds like.
You're pretty much there. But that was a very cool cameo. I meant to pay tribute. But let's talk about some of the essays in the book. I know one of the things that you like to do. This might be getting a little bit more into the Stern influence in your broadcasting, ginning up a little bit of controversy in a good way. Just trying to create. You're not afraid to have interesting conversations about issues, maybe some of which are deemed too sensitive by others. Is there any particular essay in the book that you feel like has stirred the pot and really contributed to the cultural conversation about sports?
That's interesting. Gladwell starts off with an imagining of sort of the least controversial thing, which is Tom Watson winning a golf tournament. So golf really doesn't do that. But then he quickly segues onto one of the more provocative ideas, which is, what if the African slave trade were centered not around West Africa but East Africa? Because he's of Jamaican descent, and he's a distance runner, and his point is that so many American and Western sports are influenced by fast twitch muscles, and he started looking at, well, what if the slave trade were East African, and that's more of the distance running? How would that affect things? It's at least a quite provocative question.
It's interesting.
And then when Shearer hits, so some of these essays, I mean, there are a few categories. There are some just really whimsical essays, like Jesse Eisenberg did the actor Jesse Eisenberg did a first-person account of what if his fan mail from Dan Marley were answered, and then there was an essay, what if the basketball rims were smaller than the basketballs? And it's a transcript of an NBA on TNT broadcast where it turns out every basketball game ever ends in a 0-0 tie.
It's great.
But then there are the ones that are really just exercises in history, and you're learning more. You maybe knew the headline of an event, or in some cases you might not have even known a thing happened. So of course you knew that the United States participated in the Berlin Olympics, Hitler's Olympics. But Shira Springer does a story about what if the U.S. had boycotted Hitler's Olympics. And I'm not sure this falls into the questions too dangerous to ask category, but it really is provocative in the best sense, where it provokes a whole bunch of contemplations and ruminations, and you worry about or wonder about what the sporting world, or maybe world would have, how they would have reacted and how things would be different.
And that's a particularly interesting and relevant topic for today, when there's so many there's such controversy, I guess I should say, about the role of politics in sports, whether we're talking about the NFL sideline controversy, or the role of just generally speaking, how comfortable people are with politics and sports becoming intermingled in any way. And I respect, on one level, the idea of people who wanted to keep the Olympics above all that. But I mean, for me, and I'm curious what your take on this is, sports are just so interwoven into the fabric of our world that to some degree it's impossible to keep them separate. And boycotts, like eventually ended up happening in the Olympics as time went on, were probably inevitable.
Yeah, I would say you can't have it both ways. So for years, as I referenced earlier, I reported for NPR, and maybe your listeners wouldn't know this or can't believe this, but there was a strain among listeners and maybe some of the editors that are like, oh, why are we even doing sports? And the argument is sports are interwoven within the human experience, and they're a reflection of us. And in some ways they, sublimate our worst instincts, and in other days they exemplify our best achievements. And so when you make that case, even the most skeptical person will usually nod and say, well, they certainly then deserve a place at the table. But how can you make that case and then at the same time say, oh, yes, and now because they are important or because they are this thing that has fans or has a certain kind of fan that wants to keep them closeted away from controversy, how can you make the case? But of course, we should never allow politics to intrude. It's not true. It's not the way. It's an idealized. I don't even think it's idealized. It's just a rationalization of what sports should be. And so maybe at the time, people would have said, definitely at the time, Muhammad Ali, I can't believe he's so political. But looking back on the secular saint that Muhammad Ali has become, his being political helped the country and at least, reflected back on the country its own values. And that's why one of the first chapters in the book is, what if Muhammad Ali had actually won before the draft board and gotten his draft deferment? Lee Montville wrote that story. And I put it up first because he's a great writer and Ali is a great figure, but also it really shows the importance of sports culturally.
There's no more interesting trajectory in the history of American sports than Ali as a character in his relationship to the public. And that's one of the things, just one of the many threads in that wonderful tapestry of an essay that the great Lee Montville puts forth in the book. Definitely one of my favorite pieces. I wanted to ask you about my essay, really not to be egotistical, but I'm just curious if that was something you wanted to have horse racing represented in this book.
Yeah, because I think if you're doing a book on sports what ifs, it's about change. It's about change over time and an inflection point. And so people who are huge fans of sports today might not realize that the dominant sports 100 years ago were boxing, baseball, and horse racing. And boxing is almost done. Horse racing has taken on, it still has its niche appeal. Baseball's, I guess, going strong, but there's a lot of indications that it's not. But how do you do a book that talks about changing history without really acknowledging what the history was? So I guess if you're going to do sport, but that said, because horse racing isn't so culturally dominant, it would be hard, perhaps maybe if you were to do a sports what if, the daily racing form audience, you could get into, a specific Calumet stables breeding scenario, right? Or right. You could get into a specific race or a horse that, swales death or something like that. But I think that would have left the average sports consumer behind. But to talk about the horse racing industry, business, sport overall is kind of interesting. So that's why we decided that the way you did your chapter was the right way to do it, and also opened up for a lot of fun possibilities.
Yeah, well, hopefully folks I've had plenty of people reach out, listeners of the show, who've received your book as a gift already, who we're very happy to see racing included. But I think that's one thing that hopefully members of this particular audience will be interested in. But we've got a lot of readers out there and a lot of people who I think for whom the book will be either make a great gift for somebody else or that extra gift for themselves. What's something you learned about sports, Mike, in doing the research and editing for the book?
Well, the penultimate chapter is by Claude Johnson, who runs something called the Black Fives Foundation, which is about the history of the era of the Harlem Wrens and the equivalent of the Negro Leagues with basketball, although it wasn't exactly as enforced the segregation as with Major League Baseball, or at least the enforcement wasn't as long. And he essentially wrote about a play and a subculture and a tournament, none of which I'd heard of. I'd heard of Nat Sweetwater Clifton. He was an early pioneer and played for the Knicks. But there was this thing, there was a sort of jamboree of basketball, and all the barnstorming teams would get together in Chicago in the late 40s and early 50s. And because of one pass, Nat Sweetwater Clifton's Wrens team were denied a title, and they were playing against George Mikan, NBA Hall of Famer, Minneapolis team. And he lays out a plausible case that kind of delayed the integration of basketball by a number of years. Really well done chapter.
Very cool. Now, it's not just a book, it's also a podcast. Tell me about the idea for transforming the book into the podcast, and let folks know a little bit about where they can check that out, because I definitely believe it's the kind of thing that will only help book sales by whetting the appetite about the whole conceit.
Yeah, so I do a podcast every day. I do the gist, and I kind of think in terms of, my brain was thinking in terms of writing during this book, but of course I naturally think in terms of audio. And I realized there were a bunch of chapters that would make good audio episodes. And just like the book is written in different styles by different authors, and some are hardcore histories and some are, for instance, our chapter on Tarkanian was an imagined induction speech into the NBA Hall of Fame after he beat the NCAA. So I said to myself, all right, let's take a couple of these chapters and let's really produce them out in using storytelling techniques or repertorial techniques. So we have a podcast called Upon Further Review, which you can find by searching Upon Further Review. I think there's some other sports debating things podcast called that, but this is the Upon Further Review with maybe my name attached to it or the word slate. And we take 5 chapters, and one is done straight reporting by Leon Nafak, who does the Slow Burn podcast, and it asks, what if Nixon were good at football, which is a chapter in our book. The chapter was written by a Princeton historian who served as an expert and a consultant, but we had Leon do this reporting. Then we had a chapter which is an episode, I think it's the last one. It's, I think, my favorite. It's a fake Boston sports talk radio show. Imagining a world where the Patriots have been terrible for 20 years. So imagine how grumpy and angry regular Boston sports talk radio is when their team has been really good. So this imagines that Drew Bledsoe never got hurt, that Tom Brady never got in the game, and that they brought Bill Bell. I don't want to give away all the secrets, but the 2 guys that we have hosting the show, one is a great comedian named Gary Gulman, who's from Boston, and then we have a great improv actor playing the roles of Dougie and the Donk, who are these Boston sports talk radio guys. And the author of that chapter in the book is MSNBC's Steve Kornacki, and he shows up as a guest on that radio show. It's pretty funny.
It's good stuff. Very good stuff. And getting Leon Nafak, that's quite the podcasting coup these days. There's nobody sort of more at the center of what's hip in podcasts than him and Slow Burn. I think so many of the podcasts I've found myself getting obsessed with, I first have been turned on to through the gist, and it's a daily listen for me. And in addition to checking out the book, I would recommend, if the type of conversation we're having here is appealing to you, you're gonna like the actual thing when Mike's doing his thing all the much more. Make sure to check out the gist, and make sure to check out Upon Further Review, the new book by Mike Pesca. Mike, thank you so much for taking.
Thanks for having me. You're very welcome.
And now, after 2.5 shows off, back by popular demand, he is the people's champion, Jonathan Kinchin. JK, where have you been?
I'm coming in hot. I'm coming in extra degen. I'm coming in. You want a bad beat story? I got one. You want to hear how I went to the track with 100, but I went to the ATM and took out 60? I got it for you. I'm giving it all to you.
Oh, it's great. And, maybe in retrospect, I'm extraordinarily proud of last week's shows, the interviews I did with Richard Migliori and Barbara Livingston. Maybe in retrospect, we should have spaced out the me solo interview shows with the typical you and I doing our nonsense shows. But we didn't do that. It's just the way the chips fell with our crazy life and travel schedules, and the opportunity to get such A-plus guests who did a great job. And those shows were super duper well received. It's not that, but we did have a few listeners on Twitter giving us a little bit of a hard time just because of the departure in format. But today we're back with sort of
I will say this, PTF. If you didn't like the MIG one, I'm not really. I think you should probably just play daily fantasy every day. Or maybe you should go down to your local bingo hall.
You got
possibly drive an hour north or south, depending on where you live, and go play slot machines. This game's not really for you if you weren't interested in the history that MIG provided and also the insight. He said a bunch of really sharp things that we as horse players can use moving forward. If you didn't like that one, this game might not be for you.
That's so funny. I think it was just people missed you, JK. It was your fans. It was you were the people's champions. These are your people, and they just missed hearing your voice. I'm sure if it was you interviewing Barbara and Mig, they would have been just fine. But I am appreciative. I was not going to put you on the spot and ask if you'd listened to those interviews, but I'm glad to hear that you got a chance to check in. Good perennial material. Those are ones, if you did miss them, you know what? I'm not going to say go back right away. You could, you'll enjoy them, but save them, because those are DRF Players podcasts that you won't lose a thing to check those out in February. And really, I think that's going to be true of today's show and the show we're going to do later this week as well. End of the year, we kind of wrap up. You know, we probably should, I'm totally just springing this on you. You're not prepared for it. We probably should take 1 minute and talk about those grade 1 races from Los Al the other week, JK, which I've only watched once. I'm not really prepared to talk about them intelligently either. I was just curious if you had an opportunity to think at all about the winners out there, and if you think they're going to be making noise as the calendar turns in just a few days' time now, and these 2-year-olds become 3.
I'll give you 3 quick thoughts, and we can push further, or we can move on. Here's the first one. Chasing Yesterday will continue to be overbet for the rest of her career. And she's not good enough to warrant the overbetting that she will receive. I will continue to try to beat her. I know Flavian doesn't ride at Los Al very much, but someone needs to tell him the rail is dead. He put Vibrance on the rail the entire time around there, and it was very frustrating and annoying. She was probably not going to win that day. But when you put a horse on the worst part of the racetrack for the entire race, that's what you're going to get.
Tricky.
And then third, no pun intended, it's improbable that you could have back-to-back Triple Crown winners with the same connections, but this horse is really, really nice. I tried to get cute and defeat the horse based on the fact that he was going to be down on the rail. He ran huge, ran a good number. The horse is only going to improve. They say he's a big, strapping-looking thing, and he'll be fun to follow as we carry on. I would say he's the best 2-year-old in Bob Baffert's barn. And yes, that counts game winner, who was the Breeders' Cup Juvenile winner.
That's why I brought this up. Just curious if you had strong reactions one way or another, and all of a sudden taking the horse and putting him ahead of the Breeders' Cup Juvenile winner. That's an opinion, and I'm very glad. I'm glad we brought it up. What was it that made you think in such glowing terms? Was it more of a visual thing or more of a figure thing?
Well, I'm not positive about this, but I think that if it was at least comparable on the weekend, Improbable's number at Churchill that weekend would matched what Game Runner ran, or was right there around what Game Runner ran. And on most scales, he matched that performance at Los Al. So
improved it on time form, going from a 108 to a 117. And that's downgraded a little, I guess, because he was able to boss what was not a hot pace. But I'm not going to hold that against him. The raw number on time form US came back a 119, but winning by 5. And, you know, the thing that definitely impresses me, too, is more so than Game Winner in the big race, in the Breeders' Cup, who really had to be ridden. He just looked more push button, for lack of a better word, and that's a quality shared by those Baffert Triple Crown winners that makes me share your enthusiasm for that opinion a little bit.
He got himself out of a bad position, right? A bad post position. I tell you what, though, my first jockey crush ever was Joe Talamo. His ride on a horse that I had a future bet on, and I Want Revenge, when I Want Revenge won the Wood after missing the break and all that. I think he missed the break. It was kind of a weird situation. I kind of fell in love with Joe, and I was like, wow, this is great. Joe's ride on Mucho Gusto in that same race is the opposite of creating a jockey crush for a jockey. So whatever that is, that's how I felt about Joe after that race.
You were a woman scorned, JK.
Chance. He sent the horse from the outside and somehow ended up down inside. Like in a 6-horse field, he drew outside. he broke well and he somehow cleared and then went down to the rail. And then it was just a really wonky ride that I felt gave Mucho Gusto no choice, no chance in that race. Mucho Gusto's that weird Baffert that you can maybe sneak up on people with because he'll always be a little bit forgotten unless he shows up as the lone Baffert in a race. Mucho Gusto ran well enough in that race, and I'll continue to bet him moving forward.
I was going to ask, thinking there might, and I haven't done all the chart work in terms of the specific bias that day, but knowing how the track usually plays and where he ended up and how he actually ran pretty well, I was curious if he was one you wanted out of it. But still, the length of the margin of defeat, the imperiousness of the victory, it doesn't sound like you'd necessarily want to be backing him against the winner Improbable again.
No, but the thing is like when it comes to situations like that, it's not so much that the horse would have won with a different ride, but the horse would have been closer, would have been more impressive in defeat, and would have been a shorter price moving forward. So when you can find those trips, there's still something to be had there, right? It's like he was never going to win. Like same with Vibrant. She was never going to win. She just didn't run well at all. But it did her zero favors, and she ran a lot worse than I think her actual ability is. The same with Mucho Gusto. It's a we've heard it's a dressed up performance. I think there can also probably be a dressed down performance, sure. And that's kind of what it felt like. It was a lot worse. It was a lot better than it looked.
Buried is sometimes the effort you hear people use for that one, a buried good race, when there's these attributes that just aren't obvious. Let's pause back to chasing yesterday for a minute just to further your point there. So you've got the hype. This is pedigree-wise. We're talking about American Pharaoh's sister here, so the hype's always going to be there. The figure, modest, not modest enough, 105 on the time form scale. And you're dealing with a trip that, we know some figure methodologies are going to give extra credit for 4 wide, when in fact, that's really a perfect trip the way that Los Al often plays, and you're only winning by a head. I assume these are all the reasons for which you will be looking to oppose her in the future.
I just hope she shows up somewhere with a horse I love, right? Unfortunately, what happens is like a lot of these situations is these fillies show up or these colts or whatever. You have these great angles to bet against them, and they show up in a race where, like, you can't find anyone to bet against them with. And it's frustrating. We had negative info on a Todd Pletcher firster last week at Gulfstream, and the horse won because the rest of the race, like, the 3 horses that could have beat him had the worst possible trips. And so he still wins. We were still right. The information was still right. The horse was not a Todd Pletcher type that you want to bet at Gulfstream. And these situations happen all the time. And I'm fearful that will happen with Chasing Yesterday because a majority of her races will take place in California where we often see these short fields, and the horses that are probably talented enough to beat her happen to be from the Silverman's barn. He's not going to run them against her. And there'll be a lot of dodging and a lot of weirdness. I'm going to need Jerry Hollendorfer or Mike McCarthy or Phil D'Amato or Keith DeSormo or Doug O'Neill to bring me something to beat this filly with when she's 1-2 next time.
When you have those opinions, I know what you mean. We can sometimes outsmart ourselves trying to. We say, oh, well, they've beaten us before and maybe they're just going to get lucky again. And, maybe I don't want to stand in the way of this train. When the horses like that are dressed up, are that short in price, it's the right move just to keep opposing them, even if it's hard to do. And even if sometimes you have to take a lower price than you want or, just go for a horse that you normally, would want something a little bit more than. I think I just want to encourage you to continue to oppose. Before we leave the Starlet, I do want to talk about Mother for a minute, JK. Another who did time on the inside. Florent Giroux in the irons there. How do you say dead rail in French?
I can say I could probably figure it out in Spanish, like muerto. Muerto I don't know what rail would be.
We'll work on that. But do you give
I've been watching Narcos a lot, so my Spanish is actually much better than it has been.
Who knew? That's an interesting concept. Somebody who speaks Spanish, but they only know it from Narcos. You still might be able to get somewhere in life. Is this a case with Mother of? Are you more drawn towards the conclusion that there are no trips in slow races, or is this one you might say, hey, in the right spot as a forgotten other Baffert? Is she one you might want to take a chance with some other day?
No, I mean she's that filly that she's going to be bet no matter what, because it's Baffert, because she won a race at Churchill, which is you're winning a race at Churchill, you're breaking your maiden at Del Mar, you're running second in a grade 1, you're running third in a grade 1. You're going to always be bet moving forward wherever she finds herself, and like you said, there's no trips in bad races. There's no bet backs in slow races. There's no trips in slow races, and she finds herself to be in that category. If I don't want Chasing Yesterday, I want nothing to do with her, despite the fact that she was down inside a little bit. In fact, I'd rather bet her out of that. I'd love to bet Mother in the test future, right? I just don't want her here.
All right, let's move on, JK. It is the Listener Appreciation Week on the DRF Players Podcast, and that means we're basically letting listeners, more or less, program the show, and we have a ton of great questions. We're production meeting in the middle of the show. Chris Larmy has a couple of times asked us for his thoughts on the sort of state of the industry conversation that he had at Arizona with Steve Bick. I still need to listen to the piece. I often listen to the Steve Bick podcast. You can check him out on stevebick.com. You can listen to his show hour by hour every day. I recommend that people do that. I often do. I haven't had a chance to listen to that yet. I will listen to that between now and Friday, and I definitely want to piggyback on some of that conversation. Chris, loyal listener, great guy, one of the sharpest guys around, and do not want to disappoint him. Appreciate all his support over the years. You have already teased a couple of places to begin here in your introductory remarks. Let's start off with the question, JK. What was your toughest beat of the year? I surely know mine. I blocked the horse's name out, of course, but I'll try to remember while you're talking.
I've had a lot, right? I've had a lot of bad beats. I'll give you one recent and one kind of bigger picture. I think the recent one was I played a pick 5 at Churchill. I played it efficiently. I handicapped my tail off. I felt good about my handicapping. Often I feel rushed at times when I'm doing things to a certain extent. I felt good about it. And I was alive going into the last race. There was 10 horses in the race. I was alive to 7 of them. I had played efficiently to those 7. I wasn't being that reckless the rest of the way through. I was alive to 7 horses. The bottom payout was going to be $19,000. The top payout was going to be $50,000.
Okay.
I did not have a horse that was the 4 horse. I can't remember the name. But once I kind of dug a little deeper, I realized of the 4 horses I didn't have, one of them was owned by podcast listeners, podcast partners, non-podcast friends, basically family in 10 Strike Racing with Marshall Graham and with Clay Sanders. And I text Marshall, do you like your horse? This is in the middle. This is 15 minutes to post. And he says, I like the horse a lot. He's going to run back to his race when we used to have him. And so I looked and I was like, oh my God, what am I going to do? I should have texted him before. So I ended up just betting like I bet $300, I think, to win.
Is that you or me?
That's me. It's me.
Right.
I bet $300 to win on the horse. And he won it like 12-1 and blew up my entire situation. That was probably the worst beat recently I've had for a big score.
Well, what's really bad about that is we've seen this movie before with you and gimmicks and 10 strike horses. In fact, and I'm not proud of this moment, 1 iota, JK, but back in, I think it was 2016, there was some gimmick and we had like a fairly, I don't want to say argument, because it was like, because I caved like at like cheap speed, but I had proposed specifically using, and not because of the connections, just because I thought the horse had speed and there was some hidden stuff, dot matrix in a gimmick, and you talked me out, and I'm not saying it's your fault, because it's terrible of me to not push back on a horse that I legitimately liked that was owned by friends. But anyway, for about the 8th time that summer, friends of ours knocked us out of something. So, like, I'm not saying that means, oh, you should reflexively throw your friends' horses in. But at the very least, like, why didn't you send that text in the morning?
Well, I think that honestly, the honest answer to that, could be a whole nother podcast. And I made a joke about it at EquestriaCon, listening to the horsemen that bet panel. Like I've joked before I started playing in contests, I had one friend in racing. Now I have 200. That's not a joke. I have a lot of horseman friends, a lot. I just have them. I just met them. We've exchanged numbers. Horsemen are interested in what handicappers have to say. As handicappers, we're interested in what horsemen have to say. I've got a lot of numbers I can hit. And as many times as you get good info, you get bad info. And as many times as you get bad info, you get good info. And there's a lot of times in between where you get the generic info that leads you to include or leads you to toss, and both of those end up being mistakes. So and the other thing about it is you just feel bad always. Like, you look down at your text messages, you go to send, Marshall Graham a text, and you realize the last time you texted him was when you were asking him for info. Then you start feeling like a bad friend. So for whatever reason, I just didn't send the message. And Marshall is great as a gambler himself. He said, dude, never, ever, ever hesitate to text me and ask me, because he would have told me before I would have used the horse and I would have scored for 25,000 if I just used a horse. He doesn't change the price of my ticket much,
Yeah, well, right. When you're betting efficiently and you can cover a longer price for a small amount of money, that's the case. But that gets back. We spent the first part of the show with my last-minute holiday gift idea for folks. Upon further review by Mike Pesca, guest appearance, PTF. I'll put in a quick plug for another book I was involved in, but really that was Mike Maloney's book, Betting with an Edge. If you're still looking for signed copies of that, I have a handful. If you email podcast@drf.com today or hit me up on Twitter, there's some chance, first class mail or whatever, we can still probably get it to you in time for the holiday. But anyway, the lesson in there, I just thought it's so simple, but people don't realize this. When it comes to tips, 2 things I'll point out. One, of course, is consider the source. We all know, if you're involved in the industry at all, even horsemen, even people who work on the backstretch, I don't mean to be mean, but there are plenty of them that just, don't know what time it is, can't see past the end of their own shed row when it comes to talking about winners in horse races. I'm not judging. It's not really their job. They've got other things to worry about, the care of their horses. But there are plenty who just don't know. And for those people, I don't need to bother the person who I know who either doesn't know or always likes their horse. Like, there's just no reason to bother that person. They might be a great person. They might be great at their job. For constructing my bet, I don't need to know. But for the people who do know, or at least have some idea what time it is, yes, I'm very interested in hearing what they have to say. But even then, and I'll be honest, even if it's somebody who is sharp and believes the horse can't lose, I'm still very hesitant to, I'm going to say I won't do it, but I'm sure I'm weak sometimes and I do. Those horses still very hesitant to press. But those horses, they need to be included. And that's what Mike says in the book about tips in general. And this comes from his time on the backstretch and his time just living in Lexington around horse people. The idea with tips is you use them, but you don't press them. And I think that if we stuck to that, just you and me, JK, in the last few years, think about how much more money we'd have. Also important, ignore anti-tips by Jake, Prince of Keeneland, Ballas, because you just don't want to get on his anti. Don't listen to his anti-tips. Use those horses too.
Yeah, exactly. The Prince of Keeneland, he's had a couple tips lately that have been pretty good. He texted me yesterday. He's good friends with George Weaver. And I texted him early in the day. I said, does George like his horse in the last off the turf? And he's traveling. He's in New York. He doesn't respond. And then he texts me. He says, George says the horse won't lose off the turf. And so I'm like, oh, you gotta be. So I look, I didn't play the pick 5 as the last leg of the pick 5. I look and I turn on the Gulfstream feed just to see where they are. And the 4 horse is like galloping out. Well, Jake had seen my text. He threw me off. I'm thinking
that's brilliant.
The early part of that sequence, I would have been alive for a $20 pick 5 if you would have told me that.
That's
anyways,
awesome. That's so great.
My other bad beat was just a theme. And that theme was 3 times this year in contests. I went all in for I went all in. I bet over, $15,000. One time it was $30,000. The other time it was $40,000 on double combinations in stakes races where I singled a horse and I used other horses that I liked, the logicals, covering all, possible combinations I thought could happen. And the equivalent of all of those together was probably worth, I actually kind of did the soft math, almost $1 million ish,
Jeez.
like, 800, 850 ish. The first one obviously was the Derby one where I hit Yoshida in the first half of his spread, and then I singled Justify and hit him, but I got disqualified for not following the rules. That cost like 50,000. But that was a successful one where I hit the single. Belmont, I hit the single of Justify, but I missed the single. I missed the spread of Sadler's Joy, High Happy, Robert Bruce, who went on to win a Grade 1, who went on to win the Arlington Million, Channel Maker, who ran off the screen in one situation. All of those horses were horses that I had, and
no spring qualities.
Spring beats me at 18-1 and has not won a race since then. Has been 3rd, 7th, and 5th since then. Bad beat. And then obviously the Breeders' Cup Betting Challenge, where probably the least, obviously going to probably invoke the least sympathy from folks because I was just really pretty wrong. But hitting the first single of Enable and then obviously missing the classic, but just the idea, which is something that I still struggle to think about when I think back about it, the idea of risking that much money on one horse to win. Because that's essentially what's happening. I mean, I've bet Enable to win.
You're taking a win bet and you're complicating it more or less.
Right, and I hit all of the singles, which is not an exact science. I'm very proud that I hit those singles, but I missed the most important part of it, where I had 5 horses, five horses at Belmont, 4 horses at Churchill and hit Yoshida, 4 horses at Churchill hit, 5 horses at Belmont missed. 4 horses at Breeders' Cup and missed. So those were tough because they were. I felt like my money was in good. I felt like I had done what I needed to do to get to that position, and took really big swings and missed. And those were the bad beats that probably stuck with me the most, rather than the weird horse that snapped me and
I don't think the Breeders' Cup even counts. I mean, I feel like you can't really call that a bad beat. That's just being wrong. One thing I will ask you, and this is just so you and me and listeners can learn or think about things in a different way for future experience. What would have happened in those 2 instances if you had just put it all on the nose of Enable and Justify? Would you have won either of those contests, do you think? Would you have ended up in a place that you would have been happy with? I just made that off-the-cuff observation that you were taking a win bet and complicating it, but there may be some truth in it, or I may be totally oversimplifying. What do you think?
Yeah, I probably win Belmont in hindsight, but that's hindsight, right? You and I both have reflected upon that and talked to a lot of other people that have resumes and horseplay that we respect. That the circumstances of Belmont Day are what allowed that score, the final score of that contest, to not rocket.
Right, to not be what it could have been. It came in any reasonable guess of what the final score of that would have been, including by the winner, Karen, would have put the winning total much, much higher than it was. It was somewhat anomalous.
Right. Robert Bruce wins the turf. Suddenly someone hits a $300 try, a $2,500 exacta, those things happen. They didn't happen. Okay. Now we go on to the Belmont. If Justify gets beat, it doesn't matter. That's not even part of the conversation. If someone other than Gronkowski runs second, then suddenly now it's a much more formful finish. It's someone has it a little bit more on the nose, and now the scoreboard blows up a little bit too. So in hindsight, which I think is probably an unfair site to have this conversation from.
Apologies.
I win betting the 30,000 on Justify to win. I win that contest the way that it finished.
But you make great points as to why you made the decision you did, and why even if you'd won, that doesn't make it the right decision. People spend way too much time focusing on outcomes rather than decisions. Going into the decision has to be the fact that you basically had two big time rags. And what I mean, using it in the poker sense of like horses that you couldn't really make contenders before the race, mucking up both of those races with Spring Quality winning the turf. Sorry, apologies. Congrats if you were smart enough to have the horse. I didn't and wouldn't again, except as a trainer throw in maybe. And maybe I screwed up in that regard. But that's another conversation. And Gronkowski, who, I think was just absolutely improbable, and nothing that's happened since makes me feel any differently about that. So that's a good point. What about the breed? I don't remember if we talked about this. It's coming back to me that we had this exact conversation in the aftermath of the Belmont, but I'm not remembering about the Breeders' Cup and how you feel about that, and if you should have just bet to win, and then had options potentially depending on where you were.
Two things. One is, let me back up a second. When you're doing those situations that I've done, you go all in at the end, you have to understand that the goalpost will move. Like whatever the leader has going into the last race is not what the leader ends with. The goalpost will move because people are firing for that person. People are going all in. And so you have to kind of set a target in your mind of what you think it's going to take, / the best way to maximize your opinion. Where can that get you? So when at Belmont, I felt like 30 was definitely not where it was going to end. I needed to maximize my opinion of the last two races to get to a certain point. And the important part to realize is that if I would have hit that bet, I would have won $70,000 more. So I'm walking away from there with like 150. So there's that has to be taken into account when you're making those decisions. When it comes to the Breeders' Cup, Enable went off at 4 to 5. So if I bet the 40,000 on Enable at 4 to 5, here's the tricky part about that. Is suddenly the goalpost moves to almost 80,000. And now people see more people that are up there higher. People start doing things that are different. Chuck Grubb, instead of betting 15 or 20 or whatever he bet on Accelerate, now he's betting more in Exactas. It's way too unpredictable to try to predict what would have happened if you would have done something different. I felt like I maximized my opinion of the last two races to the best of my ability, and I was wrong, so I got beat.
Very quickly, I'll give mine. There's not a lot to it. I'll make it a little bit of a story. I'd been in a weird, slumpy place at Saratoga and went there was it a Sunday or a Saturday, and was really like in a really good place mentally of just like, I'm going to chill today. But I'm gonna look at these 2-year-olds, especially one 2-year-old, this big drama that I've been hearing since before the meet was supposed to be the fastest 2-year-old in Chad Brown's barn, that kind of thing. And I went to the paddock. We were in the paddock. We were sitting at the paddock bar. And it was one of those, and it didn't happen to be that much this year, but the horse walks by and you get that sixth sense sort of thing going on, just winner. Like this horse, it looks like a man among boys, that kind of thing. And I even bet it well. Like I didn't step out. I bet basically what the amount that was acceptable to lose on the day on the horse's nose, didn't do anything irresponsible. And of course, if you remember Ahead of Plan's first race, ahead by 2 in the stretch, we really ran. You could say the horse stopped, but really when you go back and you look at the figures. The horse ran a winning race, endorsed, happened to be better on the day and get the job done. But it was one of those things where I just felt like, you know what, I did everything right here, and I was very annoyed by it. And it lingers as my most stinging beat. And it did lead me into, I think, a full week in Saratoga. I actually left. The next day I went home to Port Washington. I had a chance just to hang with family for a few days and get my head right, and ended up coming back and having a much more solid end of the meet. A couple of days actually at the end of Saratoga, I had more in my ADW account than I did at the beginning, something that wasn't happening during the middle of the meet at all. But it's still, when you talk about the bad beats of last year, that one to me, where the horse was 1 to 50 in the stretch, and you think I might have even said out loud, man, I should have bet more. I'm remembering now, it was Alabama Day. It was a Saturday.
Your bad beat is my bad. It sucks for me too. Here's the thing, real quick, 15 seconds. I've told everybody on the show before, and you know this too. When I get beat for whatever reason, I sweat. I just start sweating. I get
flop
frustrated.
Sweat. It's called. It has a name. It's flop sweat.
Yeah, I start sweating as soon as I get beat. As soon as I have a bet, they cross the wire and I'm wrong, I start sweating. Well, I'm sitting on the dang Naira set for the first time that I was lucky enough to do the Saratoga Live thing on Naira that's on Fox. So I'm sitting on the set. I'm nervous. It's hard. It's hot up there. I'm sweating, and then I get snapped. The head of plan gets caught by the Kieran piece. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm sweating. I had sweat stains. I was making fun of a guest that was on earlier that was sweating profusely. Now suddenly I'm that guy who's trying to stay dry, and I'm sweating. And it was a bad beat for both of us. PTF. I know we were both there in spirit. That was a rough one.
Like a cross between Albert Brooks in broadcast news and Nixon in the 60 debate there, it sounds like. But you couldn't have done too badly, JK. They invited you back. So that's good. All right. You made another reference that I wasn't even sure what the heck you were talking about. Hopefully you'll remember when you were doing your intro, another story you had about something about the ATM machine, or were you just recounting one of your most degenerative moments of, is that a word, of 2018?
No, I'm just, no. I mean, the ATM gets hit from time to time, things happen. You got to make that one last, Custard's last stand.
Did you say Custard's last stand?
Is it not Custard?
Custard. There's no D.
That's what I said. I said custard.
Oh, okay. I thought you said custard, like ice cream. I know you like to crush ice cream. For a second there, I thought you got. Never mind. Continue, please.
I do not crush custard. I do not like custard.
Frozen custard, man. It's the same thing.
No. We ice cream only. No custard.
Continue.
And you had this crank and boom in Lexington. Everyone's raving about it. I'm not a fan.
It's fine. There was something. I feel bad. We're doing. I don't want to be like somebody else in horse racing media and give hard times to places in the distillery district in Lexington, but. It was. I'm not going to say anything too mean. It just wasn't like, it wasn't the fastball down the middle for me. It was like a little sweet or something. It didn't scratch the itch like my favorite.
People love it. It's just I'm straightforward, but I'm also very boring when it comes to ice cream. Give me 10 more seconds to talk about this. I'm a regular vanilla with Oreos and chocolate syrup. I don't need pralines or peanut butter and jelly swirls or beets or minty. I don't need any of that jazz. Just give me the straightforward down the middle.
I tell you what they did. I can't remember if they did a proper boozy milkshake. I don't think it was that, but I do think they took a shot of whiskey and poured it over the ice cream, which did most certainly make it better.
God bless them.
So you did not have a specific story or thing you wanted to recount? There wasn't something else from the beginning?
I haven't hit the ATM in a while. I've hit the ATM in my life. I was simply saying that the people that want degeneracy on this show, I'm coming in hot. I'm going to give them everything I got.
What was your most? Do you have one moment, one particularly degenerate moment to share? I think I like degenerate better than degenerative, which is something else. Degenerate moment of 2018. I don't have anything prepared here, but I'll try to think real quick.
2018?
Yeah.
Oh, gee, I thought you were talking about this weekend. I'm sure there was something. I was just trying to remember what it was this weekend. This year. This year, when it comes to degeneracy, the most degenerate thing I did.
Want me to hit mine?
Yeah, go.
Following around the man who looked like potentially he was dressed like a homeless man, but that also means he was dressed like Bill Belichick. Following him around in that casino in Las Vegas to figure out what he was betting, and then actually following him in on the giant winner. What was it? It was some 15-point underdog in basketball that ended up winning outright.
Oh my God! I want to say that it was like the Citadel or something. They were green. I can't remember.
Back in the day, you would have sworn he was a runner for Billy Walters. Probably not that right now, but seemed like a runner for somebody with some real money. The combination of the outfit and the amount of money created some curiosity. That was my most degenerate moment of 2018. Do you have one for us?
God, that's amazing. No, there's so many of them. I can't think of one good one.
Put a pin in it. We'll let you come back, and I am going to come back at the end of the show. And I'm going to ask you again. When I'm talking at some point, we'll get that going. We have so many good questions. We have a whole other show. Friday show, we're going to do straight questions. We'll get to a lot more. I know we went on some serious tangents here. I did want to talk about this one. Somebody was giving me a hard time. We had a couple of people asking about handicapping software and resources, which is a great topic. But in the interest of not being a shill, I was going to just point out that, we can't be the 100% objective in that we work for Daily Racing Form. This is the Daily Racing Form Players Podcast. And so it's not like I'm going to be doing some deep dive about, how great HTR is or whatever. Not that HTR isn't great, but it's like our show is a DRF show, and I think that if you're talking software and resources, the conversation really does, for me, legitimately begin with DRF Formulator and Timeform US, but I didn't want to just come out and say that like there wasn't some wider world out there. Anyway, I was trying to be nice, and then I get accused of being a shill anyway. You can't please people, can you, Jake?
Well, the basic idea is that, and the people at DRF know it as well. That is the base. That is the baseline of doing what we all do as handicappers. I need the DRF PPs in front of me. I feel incomplete at the racetrack without those. I need that. I supplement it with a lot of different things. A lot of them happen to be DRF products. Timeform US, which didn't used to be one. I was using it all along. Clocker reports, so on and so forth. I like to supplement it, but that's my canvas. The DRF PPs are my canvas. When I'm looking at conditions, when I see MC50, I know what it means. When I see the arrow pointing up with the 3, I know that it means 3-year-old and up. I need those in front of me. When it comes to software and all these other things that are out there, if you want to supplement to become a better horse player, that's fine, because I feel confident that that's your canvas is the DRF PPs. I have some pretty, one of our good friends, PTF. He's one of our friends that you would know to sound a little bit like this, Pete. That one, he started using a system, and he just uses it secondarily with what he already does with his DRF PPs and what he does with his workout reports, and it just works as a supplemental piece to him. And so there's definitely opportunity to add that to your game.
Another thing to mention about data and friends of ours, because we have multiple friends who do this, is you can purchase data from the likes of Daily Racing Form. Talk to Lonnie Goldfeder; he'll sort you right out. You can buy years of data, and if you have a computer programming background or want to hire and work with a computer programmer, you can essentially make your own PPs with that purchased data, We have multiple sets of friends who've done this and have done very well with that. And you can perform all kinds of queries. And databasing is something that's very interesting to me. Trying to come up with real hard data answers to a lot of the questions that are out there. Here, another quick plug I'll throw out for something non-DRF. If you're interested in UK and Irish racing, I've just started using, at the suggestion of Rob Dove, one of the top 10 pro punters in the UK today, a software called Proform Racing. Now, they don't have anything on US stuff, but I think it's going to be very interesting when it comes time to try to evaluate shippers coming here. And it's fantastic, obviously, for betting their races over there. They have their own speed figures. It's very customizable. It's not nearly as elegantly designed as Formulator is, I wouldn't say, or a DRF PP or a Timeform PP. It's basically an SQL database. But it's got a ton of great information. And one area, if you're interested in software, thinking about the idea of buying data from DRF, and you could try to do almost your own equivalent of some of the stuff you can do with Proform here. Another one I will mention just a little bit more about HTR. Ken Massa is the founder. This is based on a lot of the handicapping ideas of Tom Brohammer, Modern Pace Handicapping, one of the most important handicapping books for what I try to do in racing that I've ever read. And it's really cool. It's not a DRF thing. I'm not going to go on endlessly about it. I will just say it's its own kind of computerized PPs that Ken, a former what is his claim to fame? He was high up at an NHC many years ago, and I believe for years I know he was close to, and I think he might have even played in contests with the late great NHC Hall of Famer Mike Mayo. But if you're interested, Ken Massa would be a resource to try to follow up and get some more information about that type of stuff. But I really believe that when you're in the hands of DRF, I mean, for me to have access to the full-blown formulator and the full-blown Timeform US, which is a great deal, these are things that are going to definitely be able to help your play and be a great starting point in terms of the proprietary data you can get from them if you did want to sort of do your own type of PPs. Anything else on that one, JK?
I'm just more of I need the narrative. I need to be able to understand intent and goals and why a horse is here and why the connections have him here, why the riders are changing, how does that affect the post positions, things like that. And those software things are great. They're gonna give you a lot of things that have to do with pace and velocity and the horse's ability, but they're not gonna lay out the narrative that you can get from really understanding the PPs and working your way through them. And we've all cut our teeth in DRF, so I need that. I just can't. I can't tell the story without those PPs in front of me, regardless of the other information that I supplement with. So, but it's definitely something to look at. I mean, I always encourage people, you don't need to be looking at one thing. You need to look at 2, 3, 4, 5 things. You got the things you can't live without, good. But you know, spread your wings a little bit, and it helps you learn more about the game.
If you're not growing, you're falling behind. I mean, that's the way that I look at it.
And just to go back real quick, and I have no problem saying this because it's an honest assessment, and I'm going to tell you why I decided that it wasn't what I needed. When I first transitioned, I started with DRF, and I was looking for different things to do. And for a minute and a half, I gravitated towards Brisnet, and I started using the Brisnet PPs, and there was a lot of cool things in there that I started using my brain to handicap with. And then I realized, and this is no offense to Brisnet, that Timeform does everything that they were trying to do, but in my opinion, for my appetite, does it better for me. And so I transitioned to Timeform, and but I picked up those handicapping principles. I started them there, but Timeform does it, in my opinion, 50 times better. The figures are better. The pace figures are better. The illustrations are better. They have all these different numbers, and so there's nothing wrong with spreading your wings. Whatever it takes.
Find what works for you. I mean, there's plenty of good handicappers who look at DRF and BRIS. I mean, there's no. I try not to. I judge if I thought somebody was putting something out there that was like inferior and or like bad for horse players. But I mean, generally speaking, there's a lot of stuff out there trying to find what works for you in an elegant way and not get. I mean, it's tough, JK, because you're very good multitasker and you're good at looking at a lot of things and synthesizing the info. I'm a bit more old school, and then there's people who are way more old school than me who, when you talk about looking at 5 things, are just going to be like shaking their heads like, wow, how do you do that? So I mean, I think what you do is, it's just like, I'll use a first ever yoga analogy on the DRF Players podcast. Been doing a lot of yoga lately as part of my training for this race we'll talk about coming in the new year. But you don't just like hop into a complicated pose. You like build a foundation or flow. You build a foundation and you add on to it. And I almost think it's the same thing with handicapping, where you've got to sort of get the foundation of what you do and then look to add on to it in a way that makes sense for you. And some people are going to be able to take in a lot more info and synthesize it than others. We're actually over time already. I think I've been pretty nice to producer Craig lately. He probably will let us go a little bit over. Do you want to do one more question? Was there one other thing out there for this show, JK, that you want to get to, and then we'll get to as much as we can on Friday?
Yeah, let's hit it. I'm on the East Coast right now, and all you East Coasters, you should be ashamed of yourselves living in this awful time zone.
What are you talking about?
Monday Night Football doesn't start until like 8:30, so I don't have anything to do for 3 hours.
Oh
3 hours.
God.
So we can go for another couple hours if you want. I'm absolutely devastated.
I like talking to you, JK, but maybe not that much when I'm supposed to have dinner on the table in an hour.
That's fair.
We're recording.
I can see her not being happy about not being provided with her meal.
I've only got childcare for another half hour too. All right, so do your last question, and then we'll get to some quick final thoughts. And you're telling the degenerity moment too. You're not getting away without that one. And then we'll come back. I guess I could give you a pass on that till Friday if you really insist and are nice about it. But let's start with the question.
Do you have a question?
No, I was asking if you had one in that we got that hit with that barrage. I thought there was maybe one that stood out to you.
Oh, yeah. I'm sure there's one in here somewhere. I thought you were queued up with a question, but there is one. The smartest play, I think, was Steve DeCaspers asked, what was the smartest thing you did all year? Like the thing that if you could have a horse play etched on your headstone. I mean, obviously, I hope that'd be the most degenerate thing you've ever done.
He bet a lot on Justify. Just put that up there.
Which one?
You just put on your headstone. He bet a lot on Justify.
I think one of my favorite, the smartest plays that I had all year. Man, I'll be honest, and it's weird. This is the one that just popped in my head. I'm sure I could probably give you another one that's a lot more critical, that has more critical thinking involved in it. But City of Light in the race against Accelerate at Oaklawn Park, where Accelerate obviously went off at a shorter price.
That was a good day.
The way the horse had run in the prior 2 7-furlong Grade 1 races, I just felt like that he was going to get that job done, and I feel like that was one of the sharpest handicapping opinions that I had. That's one that popped to mind. The other answer is going to be something like bizarre, and while you're doing it, I'll think like some weird way where I like faded a horse and pressed a horse in a sequence or something along those lines.
The one that pops to mind for me is Ruby Notion at Saratoga, and I'm happy to tell the story because I can make fun of myself while I tell it, because as good of an opinion as it was to use Ruby Notion and as well as she paid, I was at I told you Saratoga, there were a lot of down moments. I was I was tapped in the ADW account at that moment. So I ran up to place bets. I made like smart, very complicated, Dutchy kind of combination things. But I basically managed in the new environment where it's hard to hit a signer. I managed to turn a double into a signer and basically give away a bunch of money. So that was bad betting. All I had to do was say $1 and I would have been okay. But I lazily made the bet and ended up having to deal with that annoying nonsense.
That reminds me. I think that an end of the year cheers is probably appropriate for the folks at the NTRA who got that deal done. Because I'm telling you right now, I don't think I had a signer this year.
That was my only one. Everything else managed to the handful of other hits managed to stay under. In my case, except for one lazily bet double. So absolutely. I mean, so many folks over there, Keith Chamblin, Chris Larmy, folks, Judy Wagner. I mean, I shouldn't start listing because there's so many to list. So many people helped out with that, going all the way back to Mike Maloney sharing his taxes back in the day. But absolutely, it makes a difference. It makes life a little bit easier for a whole lot of people. All right. You had, where are we?
Golly, we're at that degenerate moment. I cannot. I'm telling you.
All right, I'll let you off the hook. We have another show in a few days. Come up with now you've got to come up with a really good one.
I know. I'll tell you this much right now. When you're at the Eddie Logan, you walk out, you go down those stairs. There's an ATM down there. That's pretty damn degenerate that I know that. So I feel good enough. I feel good enough sharing that moment that's happened to me at least once.
See, I'm looking for something like, it was June and you hit the pick six and you bet it all back on the WNBA finals or something. Like that's what I'm hoping for. Not random ATM visits, but it's okay. We tried.
Okay. Yeah. I'll give you something by Friday. I mean, I got an encyclopedia of them. So
exactly. So, I froze you. You just got caught looking at that one. Yeah. Hit me with a final thought, JK, and then we will wrap this episode of the DRF Players Podcast.
Look, I previewed that you're getting the rougher around the edges version of JK on this show. Let me just be honest with you guys, all you listeners out there. If you have 33 followers and you say something stupid to me on Twitter, I am going to type a response. And then I'm going to say to myself, he's only got 33 followers. No one even saw it. And then I'm going to delete it. I'm going to send it to all my buddies so they can make fun of you privately. And then I'm going to grab a beer and watch Monday Night Football.
So, I love it.
So you got to have 1,000.
That's pretty high threshold. 500, you wouldn't
be really mad for me to respond. But taking shots and you got 33 followers and you have that one thing on your timeline that all crazy people who tweet have.
Hey, no politics on this show.
Not listening to you.
Too funny. JK with the sort of postmodern, updated, wise guy version of don't feed the trolls, because that's essentially what you're saying. It's like if somebody's just trying to get a rise, they only win if you give them a rise. So if nobody, it's like, and it's also sort of the postmodern wise guy version of if a tree falls in the forest and there's nobody there to hear it, does it make a sound? And that's something that I can think back to the way we chose to respond to a certain YouTube video earlier in the year that I think explains the philosophy, though there were several snide comments on this show. And on
it's why Raging Bull will never get picked on this show.
Oh my God, Raging Bull. Now that is an obscure DRF Players Podcast reference I'm not going to explain it because it will come up on the DRF Players Podcast Christmas quiz. And I'm proud to announce we have our contestants, and they'll be familiar to most of you because their names have come up on the show. Matt Scarlatta, a.k.a. the guy from the Ring Bet, Drew Coatney, who's asked, I don't know, maybe a dozen great questions, maybe more over the years on this show. And I'll let you announce the third since he's your fellow Austin guy.
The man who created the bingo board, the man who's responsible for, I honestly think, my first photo shoot where I was doing in the Austin magazine where I went out there with the horse and the laptop. our buddy Gene Menez.
Excellent. So we'll have those three. I'm preparing questions, JK. I'll get my rough drafts to you. You will help me. We want to toughen these up. We want to find. I'm pretty sure I'm very happy having them battle to be, have the most knowledge of the show. But this is going to put them to the test, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So that's going to be basically we've got the question and answer show next week. Not next week. This week on Friday, we'll do a Santa Anita opening day preview, and then we'll do the Christmas quiz, and then we're going to have a best of if I get my act together and can start pulling clips for that. It's going to be a fun rest of the year on the DRF Players Podcast. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you, JK. Thanks, producer Craig, as always, and of course, Willie Nile. Yes, that was him playing in Western New York the other night. To the folks who asked about that, he's great live. Absolutely go see Willie Nile. Travis Stone, of course, voice of the Kentucky Derby, helps us out with that voiceover as well. We will be back on Friday. I'm Peter Thomas Fornatale. May you win all your photos.